All right, you guys, Mr. Medellin here. Today we're going to be covering contrast, and it's one of the image quality factors. So we're referencing the Image Principles book again, and I believe it's chapter 27, and it's going to be under contrast. So we started the image production course with exposure, density, and then we went into contrast. And with contrast, it's one of the image quality factors. Now contrast is the difference between various densities or adjacent densities or various or adjacent brightness levels. So we said this: if you take an x-ray, you're going to have grays, blacks, whites on the image, and if the x-rays went right through everything, it's either going to be all white, or all black, or if it absorbed everything, it'd be all white, correct? So you wouldn't have an image. So contrast has a diagnostic value because it provides us with the ability to see different structures. So contrast, I want to make sure you understand the word contrast. So contrast, not even related to x-ray, contrast just means the difference between something. All right, so if you see that there's a big difference, it's high contrast. If there's a small difference between two things, it has to be relative compared to something, right? If it's a small difference, then that's going to be low contrast. So just keep that in mind. So in our case, we're talking about radiographic contrast and subject contrast, and we're going to talk about receptor contrast as well. So we'll talk about those three types of contrast. So in regards to radiographic contrast, it's the variation of the differences in densities or adjacent densities or brightness levels. So contrast now we kind of refer to as like a grayscale. So grayscale is exactly that. It's going to be a level of grays. So the way that they break up the grayscale, it's either going to be short scale or it's going to be long scale. All right, so grayscale is going to just be the variation of different brightness levels and densities. So we're going to write here short scale on this side, and on this side we're going to write long scale. So maybe we'll go in the lab and we'll take an exposure too, and we'll do two variations to show you guys exactly the differences in contrast, and we'll talk about how the influencing factors such as KVP, which used to be the primary controlling factor, is no longer the case in digital systems. It's going to be the lookup table, the processing algorithm, and the histogram. So we'll write that on the board just a little bit here, but let's go back to the grayscale for a second. So short scale is going to be very few densities. So very few densities, and in terms of digital terms, we're saying view exposure levels. All right, so very few exposure levels. So we'll put few exposure levels. All right. So few densities, few exposure levels. That's going to be a narrow dynamic range, or a narrow window width. Okay, so I'm going to put that on the board here. A narrow width of the scale. Okay, or a narrow dynamic range. If I can spell it correctly, right? Dynamic range. Now, short scale. Anytime we talk about short scale, we think about black and white. We think about bone work, a hand x-ray, a foot, a spine, a skull. That's bone work. You're focused on the bone. You want to have a big separation of the densities. So when we say short scale, we say few densities, it's going to be more black and white. So when we talk about the differences in densities, they're going to be a bigger difference. So I think about it as steps. So the steps are going to be greater. So the differences between the exposure levels are going to be greater. They're more considerable, right? So more black and white, and there's a bigger difference between the adjacent densities and exposure levels. So bigger differences in exposure, bigger differences in exposure levels or densities. So if you looked at it in terms of a scale, it would be, let's say, black, gray, and then white. You're not going to have very many densities. Black, gray, and white. That's it. So if you looked at it in terms of steps, they're going to be big, giant steps. Again, black, gray, and white. Now, when it comes to long scale, it's going to be the totally opposite. It's going to be many densities, many exposure levels. All right, so we'll write that down. So many densities, many exposure levels. and that are represented on the image. All right, and look, it's going to be totally opposite. So I've often said this, if you focus on one and you know one, the opposite will be true. So in long scale, you're going to have a wide width. You're going to have a wide dynamic range. And again, digital systems have a wide dynamic range in general. Now, we have here more black and white for short scale, right? But in long scale, it's going to be more gray tones. So if you have more densities and you have more recorded exposures, it's going to be longer. You're adding it to the scale, it's longer here, right? So now the differences are going to be less. So you're going to have less differences between the adjacent densities and exposure levels. So less differences between the densities and exposure, okay? So between exposure levels and densities. So this is how we would look at it in comparison. And if you remember, we said short scale, we think about bone work. When we talk about long scale now, you're looking at many densities. This is usually our soft tissue. And the biggest and greatest example is a chest x-ray. The chest x-ray has the spine in the back, it has the air in the lungs, it has the heart muscle, it has blood, it has bronchioles, it has all these different objects that are all going to attenuate differently. And you're going to get differences in shades of exposures and differences in densities. So long scale, you're going to see many gray tones. And usually with that, you're going to see a lot more objects represented on the radiographic image. So long scale, I think about a chest x-ray. Short scale, I think about bone work, such as a hand, a foot, an ankle, right? Something you're going to see primarily bone. So here, long scale, somebody was saying the other day, Mr. M, do we ever do x-rays just on bone? Do we do soft tissue? And I said, no, we do. And with that one, when you want to see soft tissue, you want a longer scale. Sometimes we do it for the bicep muscle, sometimes for the shadow of the Achilles. I've done x-rays for the hamstring, also in the back. So it doesn't always have to be for bone. So if you want soft tissue, you want to have more gray tones because you can have a bigger separation of the object. All right. So if you look at it in steps now, and in terms of the scale is going to be longer. You're going to have black, dark, dark, dark gray, dark, dark gray, dark gray, gray, light gray, light, light gray. Then you're going to have white. So you're going to have all these different colors. And now if you look at it in terms of steps, the steps are going to be gradual. All right. So one of the examples that I use is going to Lowe's, Home Depot, right? You grab some paint cards from the paint section. If you often look at the paint, they have the paint kind of blending into each other, right? So you can see that the differences in paint colors are going to be less. But if you go ahead now and you only grab maybe a color from one end, one color from one in the middle, and then another color from the end, and you put them together, now the differences are going to be greater, correct? So again, in terms of grayscale, you're either going to have short scale or you're going to have long. So look here, the differences in density is less, correct? So you're going to have what's called low contrast. So long scale is associated with low contrast or decreasing contrast. Over here, you're going to have high contrast because the difference is greater. Okay, we'll do like that. So again, I think about it as steps. And one of the stories that I share with my students is the story of the Winchester House. It's something that's with me forever. If you guys ever been to the Winchester House, I like ghost stories and all that kind of stuff. But we went to the Winchester House, and if you've been there, there's two sets of stairs that are right next to each other. There's regular size stairs, and I think they're about 10 inches in difference. And then they have these little itty bitty stairs, right? Because she was probably about that big, right? And I remember taking the tour, and I was walking down the stairs, regular stairs, and then the little itty bitty stairs, regular stairs. And my wife, she's like, would you stop it, right? And I yell out loud during the tour. I'm like, this is contrast. And she's like, what is wrong with you? And she actually kind of just walked away, right? So, but it's a true story. And I think about contrast, the big difference, you guys, the big step, that's high contrast. The lower the difference, those are the tiny little itty bitty steps. There's more of them, right? And that's low contrast. So for me, radiography, it doesn't stop. Everything's either healthcare, medicine, or radiography for me. But what we're going to do is, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to show you one of the little things that we kind of talked about in class, and we said, what are some of the things that affect contrast? And one of the things was KV, right? But it's not the primary controlling factor. The primary controlling factor for digital contrast is the lookup table, the processing algorithm, and the histogram. So there's two histograms. There's one that you see during the pre-processing, and then there's one that you see after the image is taken, correct? So these are now the controlling factors. But KVP is still going to influence contrast. So if you were to go ahead and use, let's say, 60 kV, and over here you had 70 kV, you know KV is the controlling penetrating power of the X-ray, right? The penetrating ability of the X-ray comes from KVP. So the wavelength is going to change. Make that a shorter wavelength. So here, if this is your object here, you're going to have, let's say, 2 X-rays go through, and it's going to hit the IR with 60 kV. Of course, this is just hypothetical here, but when you increase your KV to 70, you're going to have twice the amount of X-rays go through. Okay? You're going to have twice the amount of X-rays go through. This is our 15% rule, right? So when you have more X-rays going through, imagine this, you guys, as more densities. Versus over here, you guys, this is all the density we have, the recorded exposure. So you're getting more recorded exposure levels when you increase the KVP because more X-rays are going through, right? So now, if you thought about it in terms of scale, right, this is going to be long scale, this is going to be short scale. Again, short scale is going to be a very small amount of densities. You're going to get more densities, more exposure levels, that's long scale. Now, one of the things that we share in class is contrast is hell, right? So, I'm going to go ahead, it's related to KVP. So, when we say contrast is hell, when you have high KV, it's going to equal low contrast, and it's going to be long scale. Okay, I haven't worked out one for short scale yet, but it's coming, right? We'll think about something. I kind of thought about something, I'm like, it doesn't flow very well, but we'll think of something. But when you have a higher KVP, you're going to get lower contrast and a longer scale. So again, it's going to influence the image, but it's not going to be the controlling factor for the image in terms of digital. It used to be for film, but it's no longer the case for digital systems. Now, other things that affect contrast are going to be OID, grids, right? So let's go ahead and go through that really quick. So OID affects contrast as well. So I'll give you an example. All right. All our patients are always happy, right? You have the X-rays coming through. This is going to be a C-spine lateral that we're doing. Notice there's a big increase of OID. And what do we call that increase of OID? We call it the air gap, correct? So this is the air gap technique here. So if you had your receptor here, your IR, when the X-rays go through, remember scatter diverges. Scatter goes off at weird, crazy angles. So when you have an increase of OID, you're going to have less scatter reach the receptor. Less scatter is going to reach the IR. So if you have less scatter, you're going to have less recorded exposure levels. And if you have less recorded exposure levels, you're going to have less density. And we're going to say densities, we'll make it plural. If you have less densities, you're going to have a shorter scale. So if you have a shorter scale, what's that going to do for contrast? It's going to go up. It's going to increase contrast. So you're going to have a higher contrast. All right. And again, I would refer back to the ART outline, the content specification outline. There's a chart on there. I can't remember the page. I think it's page 7. Don't get me wrong. But there's a chart, and it tells you what exactly affects what. But in the newer ART outline, they remove contrast from it. So that's why I'm still going over it with you right now. Now, increase of OID, you're going to have less scatter reach the IR, less recorded exposures. You're going to have less densities, shorter scale, higher contrast. Okay. Now, the other thing is going to be the use of grids. Grids are going to improve contrast. They're going to increase contrast as well. Why? Because you're absorbing the scatter before it hits the receptor. And if you take away the scatter, you take away the unwanted exposure levels, unwanted densities, and that's going to make the scale again shorter. So keep that in mind. Anything that reduces scatter or reduces recorded exposure is always going to decrease the scale, and you're going to have an increase of contrast. It's always going to be higher contrast. It's going to be more black and white. So with grids, you know grids are going to be used to attenuate scatter, correct? So I'm going to draw an exam here with no grid. All right, so here's our patient. Always happy, right? So when scatter is produced, the scatter is going to hit the IR. But now, if you add a grid, all right, here's our patient. But now we're going to add a grid. So this is your grid, and then here's your IR. Remember, the grid's always placed between the IR and the patient. What's the grid going to do? It's going to absorb the scatter before it reaches the IR. So again, less recorded exposures, right? Less density, shorter scale, higher contrast, right? There's a chart at the end of the chapter that I would suggest that you read, and it goes over everything that affects contrast, right? It's always going to be at the end of the chapter in terms of the principles book. I like that chart. I would go and take a look to see exactly what's affecting what when it comes to either exposure, contrast, spatial resolution, distortion. There's a chart at the end of each of those chapters. I recommend everybody reading that. All right, now, subject contrast. Okay, subject contrast. What does subject pertain to? The patient. Okay, the subject is the patient. So our patients are made up of all kinds of tissues, right? Including ourselves, right? So here's a patient, they're lying on their back. I'm gonna draw, let's say they're vertebrae, that's bone, correct? That's bone, put a B right here. And then let's say they have muscle, right? They have the psoas muscle, put an N for muscle. Let's say they're laying down this way here, so anatomical position like CT and MRI. So let's say here, you guys, the stomach is here. So the stomach has, let's say, fluid, right? It has water, it has juices, right? So let's say it has, I don't know, put water here, W, right? And then we have the air in the lungs, right? We put an A here. And let's say they have some fat, some adipose tissue. Well, if you remember, each of these have different atomic densities. So when the x-rays interact with the patient, they're gonna go right through the air. Some of the x-rays will get stuck in the muscle and go through, and some of the radiation will be absorbed by the bone. So you have a differential absorption occurring here. You have different rates, right, of attenuation because the subject is made, right, of different type of materials, different tissues. So you have varying degrees of absorption, and the varying degrees of absorption are going to give you differences in recorded exposure levels, correct? So this is where you get subject contrast. So subject contrast is the result of different degrees of absorption. You have x-rays that are going to pass through, right? That's going to be exit radiation, remnant radiation in the receptor. That's radiolucent, right? The objects are radiolucent. You're going to have radiopaque objects absorbing the x-rays through the photoelectric effect. No x-rays are going to go through, it gets stuck in the object. And then you're going to have some radiation that's going to scatter, correct? And if it happens to fall on top of the receptor, that scatter is going to add unwanted density, correct? So you have all these different things, you guys, that are contributing to subject contrast. But subject contrast is going to be related to the patient, is different degrees of absorption, okay? All right. The last thing here is receptor contrast. Receptor contrast. Now, receptor contrast is related to contrast resolution. So contrast resolution, the controlling factor, it's a fixed characteristic. You can't change it. We cannot change it because contrast resolution is controlled by bit depth. So bit depth, right? A bit is a unit of data, right? And I remember one of my students had a really good analogy. She said that, oh, Mr. M, bit depth is like a well. The deeper the well, the more it can fill up with water. But in this case, it could fill up with X-ray signal. So the higher the bit depth, right, the more signal can be created. Or the more signals that can be recreated, guess what? It's going to make your scale longer. So it's going to give you more shades of grays. So when it comes to bit depth, there's a formula. And it's 2 to the bit depth squared. So if you have, for an example, you have 2 to 8 bits, right? This is what you're going to see. And for the longest time, I didn't understand it. I just kind of memorized, right? That it was 256 shades of gray that you're gonna see. And I didn't really understand it, right? And then I started teaching on, oh my God, it makes sense, right? So it's gonna be 2 times 8 times. So 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. Where are we at? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, right? So 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 2 is 16. 16 times 2 is 32. 32 times 32 is 64. 64 times 2 is what? 128. And 128 times 2 is 256. So that's how they get to 256 shades of grays. All right, so this is usually going to be where it starts off at. And it can go all the way up, you guys, as high as it wants to, 16, 32. And the more bit depth, you're going to see more grays. More grays is going to give you more visualization of the object. So this is what contrast resolution is, and that's what receptor contrast is. So the bit depth, the number of tone values, right, that can be fixed in an area is known as quantization. All right, so the number of bits per pixel, I'm gonna put that down. The number of bits per pixel is known as quantization. So each little square can hold a certain amount of signal. It's fixed. It's something that you're not going to change. So receptor contrast resolution is a fixed component. It's controlled by bit depth, and that's the number of bits per pixel. If you go higher in bit depth, you get more grays. More grays gives you more visualization of the object. All right, so that's kind of our quick take on contrast. I know there's more related to contrast, but this is kind of just a brief overview to help you understand different types of contrast, okay? Thank you.